Welcome, guys, to my new podcast episode. In this episode, we will talk about the planet Uranus. Basically, some of you might have heard that Uranus will enter the sign of Gemini in 2 weeks, and this is a very big astrological event because Uranus has been in the sign of Taurus for the last 7 years. So Uranus is one of the outer planets representing more of generational energy, and whenever Uranus is changing its sign, it's like a very big event because basically it had such a long impact in one sign for such a long time. So once the planet is changing signs, the political, global, and also in some cases individual shift will be very strongly felt. So I will use this episode to historically and astrologically explain the symbolism and importance of the planet, and then we will also talk about the current astrological meaning of it. So this podcast episode is also focusing on the planet Uranus because of another reason. So Uranus is actually the first planet that comes after the traditional order of planets. If you have listened to my last podcast episode, you know that there are 7 traditional planets which are in a specific order. The order goes as following. So we have the Moon, then the Sun, then Mercury, then Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and then Saturn. And Saturn was the planet seen as the boundary or as the border between the sky, between whatever was in the sky, and between nothingness. So Saturn was actually kind of the border between, or it was giving or seen as a border within the sky. And so when Uranus was discovered much later, compared to the traditional planets, Uranus kind of broke with that order, and it brought something new. It brought the idea that there might exist other planets, and those planets might have also an influence on how life on Earth is working. So this is why, for me, it is very interesting to talk about, because it kind of questions a lot of things about modern ideas and traditional ideas, specifically to astrology. So I think since Uranus is the first one to break the order, it makes sense for me to talk about the planet now, as I was talking about Saturn in the last podcast episode. So as I said, we will talk about Uranus first, as a planet, and then later on we will talk about its meaning being in the sign of Gemini. So first I want to talk about rulership in general, and starting off with some basics about it. So in astrology, the planets and the luminaries are divided into different groups. The biggest distinction, however, is between the traditional and the modern planets. So the traditional planets, including also the Moon and the Sun, are Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And these planets were or are still seen with a naked eye from Earth. And there is this philosophical astrology thing that everything in the sky that is visible from Earth and also perceived from Earth somehow represents life on Earth. So seeing things, or sight in general, was always very important to emphasize. However, the idea or the concept of visibility and seeing things is something I want to talk about later again, because I do have some second thoughts on that. On the other hand, the modern planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, were discovered much later and are not visible with the naked eye. So these planets were discovered either through mathematical calculations or new technologies such as a telescope. As you can see, astrologers still include the planet Pluto here, even though scientifically it is no longer considered a planet. So basically there's this ongoing astrological discussion about whether astrologers should include Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto into their calculations, since these planets are not visible with the naked eye and therefore do not fully align with the philosophy that everything visible from Earth influences human life on Earth. This discussion is actually very big, okay? It really divides the astrological community, mainly into traditional astrologers who only use the 7 planets, and modern astrologers who would also include the modern planets as well. However, this division between modern and traditional astrologer is not as fixed as it seemed to be, because there are some astrologers who do include the planet Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, but they do not say that those planets rule over a sign. As I explained in my last episode, every planet rules over a certain sign. So it functions somehow as their parent. And in traditional astrology, every planet would rule over 2 signs, representing the active and passive energy of each planet. So for example, Mars rules over both Scorpio and Aries. Venus rules over Taurus and Libra, Mercury rules over Gemini and Virgo, Jupiter rules over Pisces and Sagittarius, and Saturn rules over Capricorn and Aquarius. The 2 luminaries, the Sun and the Moon, are the only ones ruling only over one zodiac sign. And the Moon rules over Cancer and the Sun rules over Leo. So these other astrologers, they might keep the traditional order of rulership, but they still include the modern planets as having some other impact within the chart. On the other hand, classical modern astrologers use modern rulerships. So in modern astrology, Uranus rules over Aquarius, Neptune rules over Pisces, and Pluto rules over Scorpio. So the only planets ruling over 2 signs are therefore Mercury, ruling over Gemini and Virgo, and Venus ruling over Taurus and Libra. There are even some discussions where people are saying that Taurus is actually ruled by the planet Earth and Virgo by the asteroid Chiron. However, the main discussions always remains between the planets Uranus, Pluto and Neptune and the other 7 planets. In my own astrological praxis, I do use modern rulership. However, I kind of keep both. I think of Uranus, for example, being primarily ruler of Aquarius and Saturn being the secondary ruler of Aquarius. Hereby, I kind of am leaning on the astrologer Nicholas Stoyanovich, who was one of my favorite astrologers and who also used primary and secondary rulership. And personally, I felt like it works. In my praxis, it definitely works. So I believe also that this rulership discussion is very interesting because it opens so many facets of how we perceive modernity, how we think of what is modern and what is traditional. And I think it is definitely a topic for another podcast episode. However, in this episode, I'm mainly focusing on the planet Uranus. So one thing about the modern planets is that each modern planet has been discovered at a certain point. And when it comes to the discovery, the man William Herschel discovered the planet Uranus on the 13th March in 1781 from his home in England. And he was using a reflecting telescope. So Uranus was actually the planet being discovered by new technology. That makes Uranus the first planet who was discovered by new technology. When it was clear that Uranus was an actual planet, because they first thought it might have been also an asteroid, this was kind of a very big historical moment, because Uranus would basically expand the border of the already known 7 traditional planets. So therefore Uranus and its discovery really changed the boundary of how we perceive the solar system in general. Just think about it, Uranus being this planet kind of boom. No, there is not only 7 planets, the line goes on, and there's now suddenly this planet Uranus who kind of is breaking or disturbing the concept of how we perceive the sky since ancient times. And I want to add some thoughts on that because first, I find it interesting when we speak about discovery when it comes to planets. This reminds me a bit about how we would learn that America was discovered by Columbus. And in anti-colonial discourses, we reject this kind of historical narrative as America had already existed before white settler would discover or basically colonize it. And so existence of land, same as the existence of planets, doesn't start with its discovery. So the planet Uranus has already existed. However, as I mentioned earlier, it is said that astrologers would believe the stars have only a symbolic meaning for humans once they are being seen and once they are visible to us. Therefore, some astrologers argue that Uranus started representing life on Earth the moment of its discovery. This is also why some astrologers would not include the planet Uranus for astrological analysis in the birth chart of a person who was born before 1781, so basically before its discovery. And personally, I'm not sure how I think about this actually, because sight and visibility in general have a very colonial history. So that ancient astrologers not only used elements which were visible, they also used mathematical points, such as, for example, the lunar nodes. And for them, those had like also very important astrological impact. So not everything ancient astrologers would use was actually visible. So I think the discussion actually about visibility is often retroactively used by traditional astrologers nowadays, basically as an argument to justify excluding Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, even though ancient astrology itself wasn't purely based on visibility. So now what astrologers did, they used the discovery, or they are still using the discovery, to examine or to derive what symbolic meaning a planet has. So usually the discovery, or usually the symbolic meaning of each planet is kind of like derived from the astronomical energy of the planet. So for example, Venus and Jupiter are the brightest stars in the sky, and therefore they are seen as a very positive, or as planets who brighten up your life as well. However, for new discovered planets such as Uranus, it is important to acknowledge the historical context when the planet was first discovered. So during my research, I found that someone wrote this about Uranus' discovery. This discovery was made 9 years before the French Revolution, and it was a time of great tumult and revolutionary ideas. It said that we only discover a planet when we, as humankind, are ready to experience its complete influence. Uranus is a planet characterized by rebellion, change, and disruption. So basically, this paragraph connects the discovery of Uranus with the French Revolution, which happened 9 years later. Personally, I think referring to the French Revolution and modern, specifically post-cultural astrology communities is something that we do see so often on social media. However, this is like more of a lazy political analysis of the year 1781, as this mainly centers European revolutions. So thinking about you're finding this like planet Uranus in 1781, and then you're like, oh, okay, the French Revolution happened 9 years later, which is a very long time, and say that the planet Uranus has to be connected with the French Revolution is, in my opinion, like wanted to speak Albanian. It's kind of like very lazy. Like, why don't you like do a bit more research about the year 1781? It is really like centering a European history, and is really centering European revolutions. So this 18th century in general was strongly associated with revolutions. But the year 1781 was actually more closely connected to revolutions happening in nowadays Latin America. So there was this revolution in Peru led by an indigenous mestizo figure called Tupac Amaru II. Tupac Amaru II was the leader of the largest uprising in colonial Spanish-American history from the years of 1780 to 1783. And in May 1781, so in the year Uranus was discovered, like a couple of months later, Tupac Amaru II, alongside other members of the revolution, were executed by colonial Spanish authorities. He's still nowadays remembered as a very important symbol and very important figure of resistance, and also inspired other revolutionary movements across Latin America later on. And so, yeah, guys, there's like this year 1781 being actually connected with like anti-colonial movements, and then astrologers are like only referring onto like the French Revolution. Like, yeah, the French Revolution was nice, but there are also other movements, other revolutions fitting so much better to the exact year than the French Revolution. So yeah. There was like one guy, Sinclair Thompson, who described the year 1781 in the following way. Okay, and now listen, because this quote is just like, to some, civilization itself seemed to hang in the balance in 1781. To others, it seemed the dawning of a new day, when man and woman could live freely and with dignity. So one thing I want to note before talking about the quote is when astrologers historically contextualize planets, aspects, and cycles, it is important to do so very carefully. Because the way we remember the past and the way we narrate such events as the discovery of the planets does directly shape how we interpret these cycles in today's political and astrological context. So this quote really sums up pretty well what I think about Uranus, or how Uranus can be seen. So first, it actually reminded me of this card, right? Like the Ten of Swords, for people who do not see it yet. The Ten of Swords basically is like a person laying on the ground with 10 swords, literally inside of their body. But then you see on the background that the sun is going up. So a new morning is coming. And so we have this energy of something being destroyed, or something being really presented in such a destructive way, like the idea of destruction. But then we do have the morning still rising, so there's still hope. And so the quote begins with, "To some, civilization itself seemed to hang in the balance in 1781. And if we think about the structure of the solar system at that time, Saturn was still the outermost known planet. In the astrological order, Saturn represents the boundary, the edge of the known world, and the limits of structure and form. Okay, it is limiting something. It is often Saturn is associated with society, order, and civilization. So describing the year of 1781 as a moment in which civilization seemed to hang in the balance can basically reflect a crisis of Saturnian structures. It represents the crisis of the system or of the concept that we would know so far. So it represents rigid systems of power and order being basically challenged, destabilized, or pushed to their limits and destroyed. Okay? And then the quote goes on. "To others, it seemed the dawning of a new day when men and women could live freely and with dignity." Here we can also see the sense of hope. As you remember, we see here the sun going up again. When all structures are threatened, those who have benefited from them often experience their collapse as something negative. Okay? However, on the other side of destruction, there's always the possibility of something new to arise and something better to arise. And this hope, this dawning of the day, can be understood through the energy or through the promise of Uranus, having freedom and dignity. So you can only have freedom if you break the old structures. You could only have Uranus if you broke with the order we have seen before. And so with the discovery of Uranus, the existing worldview was quite literally shattered. And it was frightening in the sense that it disrupted established structures. But at the same time, it was liberating because it opened up the possibility for new ways of thinking, new ways of living, new ways of organizing society. And it carried also the promise of greater freedom and dignity. Okay, so basically, when we think now about the symbolic meaning of Uranus, we can derive the meaning from its discovery, because Uranus represented breaking through old patterns, old structures, and the societies and systems we once thought could never change. So Uranus represents therefore rebellion and uprising, and basically in a very surprising way. The fact that Uranus was also discovered through a new technology, a telescope, also emphasizes its association with innovation. Until then, Saturn was seen as a boundary between the material world and nothingness, and Uranus now represents the idea that what we once believed to be fixed and unchanging can, in fact, be disrupted and transformed in the most unexpected ways. And additionally, I also want to add that Uranus is actually visible with the naked eye, but it is only possible under literally perfect conditions. So this again challenges, in my opinion, the idea that only traditional planets should be included in astrological analysis, since Uranus does actually fit the principle of being visible with the human eye, even though only so during near perfect conditions. And here I think we could partially argue also that this might be the reason that Uranus is the modern ruler of the sign of Aquarius, because Aquarius is traditionally ruled by Saturn, and Saturn represents time. So Saturn represents time, Aquarius represents the future. So Aquarius is like participating in the idea of time. And since Uranus has always been there and was always actually visible to the eye and does represent innovation, I can see why Aquarius can be ruled by both, like this idea of time being not only separated in the past and future, but being like this thing which is maybe like more visible through cycles, or it is not linear, but also Uranus as time can change and things can change and the future has this promise of becoming better. Another way we can derive meaning from Uranus is also its astronomical information. So Uranus is a blue planet, and compared to the outer planet, it has a very unique orbit. This can be, for example, symbolically connected to Uranus and the energy of water in the sky. Thinking now about Aquarius, which represents the sky and is also the water bearer, so the name says it well, Aquarius is the sign which kind of like collects the water of the world, and it is an air sign that's connected to the sky because it basically is able to then rationalize the emotions of the society or the intensity and then create new and better systems out of that. So now it makes, for me, like actually a lot of sense that Uranus rules over Aquarius, because the color blue does represent the sky and the water, and Aquarius is also the sky and the water bearer. Uranus is considered ruling over uniqueness and individuality, and this can also be seen through the astronomical structure. As I said, Uranus has a weird orbit. It has kind of like an extreme axile tilt and makes a very unusual rotation. So in overall, it is different and unique to the other planets in the solar system. Another astronomical fact, Uranus takes approximately 84 years to complete one full cycle around the zodiac, spanning 7 to 8 years roundabout in each of the 12 signs. Uranus is a trans-Saturnian planet, so it is one of the planets coming after Saturn. The planets who come after Saturn are called trans-Saturnian planets, but also generational planets, as they move so slowly, and therefore it is said their energy has more of like this global political mundane shifts rather than only individual personality traits analysis and shifts. Another thing about Uranus as a planet is that Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. So it is often described specifically in modern astrology that Uranus functions as the higher octave of Mercury, basically because Mercury represents the thinking mind. Okay, it represents the way we think in everyday situations, it represents logical forms, and Uranus represents sudden insights. So Uranus is connected to ideas and breaking points in technology. Think about the telescope and its discovery, and the mind, thinking about like a breaking with the concepts existed so far, and also with this energy of uprisings and rebellion during that time. I think personally Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury is very, very well presented through airplanes, because Mercury is the planet of transportation, and airplanes are the fastest and safest way to actually transport one person from one place to another. Planets are like transport maxing in a way, they're like the best thing to use to like travel. And Uranus is the planet of innovation in the sky. So therefore airplanes really do connect the energy of Uranus and Mercury. Okay, so let's go back again a bit of the historical meaning of Uranus. In mundane astrology, or what we can also call political astrology, Uranus is usually connected to disruption and evolution. This basically means that all systems will eventually break after a long period of Saturnian endurance and suffering. This is the reason why revolutions and protests often do appear as like very shocking or very surprising, when in reality they are more, or have to be more, seen as the culmination of long-term limitations. Again, Saturn represented until then this like structure, the structure that was fixed and that you couldn't break in a way. And then Uranus came and there was this like big breakthrough. So basically in our world, Uranus does also represents breakthroughs from old and rigid structures. So Uranus is the breakthrough, but this breakthrough can also be connected to a crisis. As we have seen earlier with Tupac Amaru II, his execution was happening right after Uranus was discovered. But his ideas, like the idea of liberation, the idea of resisting colonial rule, still lived on after his death and actually inspired other revolutions. So basically, it's seen that Uranus liberation has or is collective. It is a collective liberation, as Uranus is also a planet which represents generations. So Uranus liberation is collective, as Uranus is a generational planet, right? So Uranus entering a new sign can bring destructiveness and chaos, but it comes with the promise of collective liberation. Uranus in every sign therefore brings instability, brings disruption and chaos, but also innovation. Uranus was in the sign of Taurus from the year of 2018 until 2026, basically until the 25th April of 2026. And Taurus is the sign which rules over money. Taurus rules over resources, over earth, over land, and over values. So Uranus brought innovation in the form of cryptocurrencies. Yes, Bitcoin has existed also in the year 2012, but the big changes or the big peaks of Bitcoin came later on. And Uranus had also a change in the artistic world. You might still remember NFTs. For those of you who do not remember, NFTs were basically a way to own a digital artwork throughout a blockchain token. So it was connecting art as an artwork, digital things, owning things, and cryptocurrencies. And I think this is a very good example because Taurus rules over property and over owning things. So Uranus and Taurus kind of changed the idea how we could actually own an artwork, that you do not only have to buy the physical thing, but you can actually buy a token or buy a digitalized way of artwork. And this was a trend, basically, and Uranus can also rule over trends, so it doesn't mean that when Uranus is bringing something, this thing has to be there for a very long time. NFTs and whatever around that energy, meta world and whatsoever, was very prominent during COVID, and now it's not so trendy anymore. Well, yeah. Additionally, in its final degrees, being in the final degrees of Uranus and Taurus, this kind of is associated with the economic uncertainty and crisis. So Uranus represents instability and Taurus represents money and resources. So with Uranus and in the sign of Taurus, we definitely could predict it, or many people predicted, that there is going to be a destabilization of global economy, which we are experiencing right now. So basically, Uranus brought or brings disruption to the global economy. But at the same time, this is also where its strength lies. As we have seen with Tupac Amaru II, that his death did not mean the end of the revolution. In the same way, an economic collapse does not necessarily mean an ending, but it can lead to the realization in our minds that the systems our resources are built on are no longer working, okay? So Uranus in the final degrees exposes the idea that capitalism and imperialism is the only way to structure a global economy. And it highlights basically the need to find alternative ways of organizing economical systems. Because right now we do experience instability and disruption and higher prices and climate catastrophe, things haven't been working and they're not working now. And this is why our economy might even weaken further. And our Earth as the landscape is going to experience the ecological crisis. However, this is also meant to be in a way because we should realize that the systems has never worked, right? The capitalist system has never worked. Furthermore, Uranus in Taurus also shows that some people might strongly try to hold onto old values. Taurus rules over values, over stability and security. So we have seen like movements like the Gen Z, for example, being very supportive and very progressive of the LGBTQ plus rights. And this is like often also like referred to as the like woke culture we are currently in. But on the other hand, we do have a very strong movement of like right-wing and conservative tendencies, thinking about threat wives, thinking about alpha males, those kind of like very conservative ideas. This has to be understood as a reaction to economic instability as well. So when there is economic uncertainty linked here to Uranus instability being in the sign of Taurus, people seek safety by returning to more traditional values and lifestyles. This is like really showing up through cultural shifts such as more conservative aesthetics. For example, wearing like longer skirts, thinking about regression indicators such as like wearing longer skirts, or kind of like, relying on the very conservative way of a gender role. So the man being the provider, the woman being like in her housewife energy. So those kind of things are a reaction to economic instability. So people do rather live in limited beliefs and conservative structures. They do prefer living in their Saturnian energy, as in like finding liberation and hope throughout the instability of Uranus. Okay, so basically this, if we have Uranus here as the new planet and Saturn being the border between what we thought of being the fixed structure, some people will keep staying into the Saturnian energy of limitations and conservatism because they are too afraid of experiencing Uranus instability, even though Uranus instability also promises liberation and also promises realizing that the old systems Saturn have never been working. They never worked, okay? Capitalism never worked. And now where we are seeing that everything is kind of like collapsing economically, we should not try to be more right-winged and try to hold on to conservative structures. We need to find new ways and new systems, and we need to have we need to be brave in finding alternative systems of organizing society. So this is like Uranus and Taurus, and I think in our society, specifically over the like past years, we could really see this like shift with society and the shift of like trying to cling onto safety, but in a way which is then very fascist and very right-winged. And then there are other peoples who do, they're kind of like they're seeing this like new morning arising, and they want to work onto liberation because that's the other way to go, right? And now we are at this like very pivotal point of Uranus being in the 29th degree of Taurus and now changing signs into the sign of Gemini. And this is going to be a very big shift because Uranus is kind of like bringing new instability in a new area of life. So yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about Uranus and Gemini now. So Uranus in Gemini is not a rulership placement. Uranus does not feel home in Gemini, but it has a very strong energy because Gemini is ruled by Mercury and Uranus functions as the higher octave of Mercury. Because of this, Uranus in Gemini actually tends to feel more expressive, more immediate, and more communicative because it translates Uranian themes into language and actual ideas. So basically, Mercury is like, our thinking over like everyday life and everything, and Uranus is like this like big idea of liberation. And when Uranus is in the sign of Gemini, those big ideas, they can kind of like be translated into like something smaller, something more adaptable to society in general, and not only like being part of an exclusive community. As I said, Uranus is a generational planet and connected to the collective. However, Gemini represents the people surrounding us and everyday life. So basically, the collective change is something which is happening within our own surrounding and not only within an exclusive, let's say, a very academic community. So instead of dealing with large-scale and abstract systematic visions, Uranus and Gemini can have the impact in our everyday communication and in our everyday transportation. It basically kind of like brings revolution to a very like everyday connection, everyday conversation. And we will first of all, probably learn how to deal with like new ways of communication. And so ChatGPT and artificial intelligence in general, Uranus and Gemini, can help us navigate through this kind of communication and can give us a more like adequate and better way of like dealing with that. At the same time, as I said, it can also come with a crisis and with disruption and instability before we do see like the better side of Uranus. So our communication can become more flexible, more adaptive, but there might also be an information overload, and it can be very hard to decide which source of information is the correct one. I do believe that there will be many groups with very different opinions, and there might be like some tension between those groups. And Uranus and Gemini is kind of like trying to bring us, or like trying to not fixate onto one ideology, but rather like to learn to navigate between different opinions and different groups. It is kind of like a way to bring us together for the same cause through communication and through translating things into an easier way of communicating, rather than like only having your own ideology. And on a collective level, astrological placements that are considered very strong or harmonious, like Uranus and Gemini, are not necessarily positive. Okay, so a planet can feel very good in a sign, but based on politics, it doesn't mean that the planet therefore is bringing positive outcomes. They can work in a very weird way. They can bring the worst outcomes possible, and then doing that so new things can arise, right? So sometimes they also like really intensify the strength of the planet. So for example, Neptune in Pisces amplified spiritual themes, but it amplified also escapism, confusion, hidden agenda. So there's like this connection between a planet being strong, where the good sides and the bad sides can be very strong as well. So Uranus and Gemini can create fluidity. Gemini represents multiplicity and many issues at once. So many issues happening at once throughout the whole world. It can emphasize, therefore, like many struggles for liberation. And it can intensify that. So liberation in general comes with a struggle for liberation. And so the stronger the need for liberation, the stronger the struggle in the first place, right? So we can see that there's going to be some attempts for liberation, and they might seem also to fail at first, but later on they can still function as inspiration for other movements. Uranus had historically been in Gemini during the American Revolution, and the American Revolution is also propagated very often as a very positive revolution with a positive outcome, where everyone suddenly had rights and there was like this democratic republic created. However, there is a very strong hypocrisy to it, as slavery did not end with the American Revolution. So with Uranus and Gemini, we should really ask ourselves who is being liberated and who profits from the liberation, right? Gemini, as I said, can represent different groups. So it can be seen that a country is going to be liberated. At the same time, there might be different groups in that country who do not actually profit from that liberation and who do actually still suffer. So the idea of like everything being liberated at once does not work. I do believe it's like really, it seems like liberation, but actually someone is profiting from that. Okay, so this is like the general idea of Uranus and Gemini. To sum it up, there will be a revolution in communication, there will be a change in transporting things, there will be a change in technology again, and maybe we will also learn how to deal or how to navigate through nowadays technology, thinking about like ChatGPT, AI, whatsoever. Now I want to talk about specific countries and specific countries being probably affected with this transit. So first of all, the US has Uranus and Gemini in its natal chart in the 7th house. The US will therefore experience its Uranus return. In astrology, a return basically means a planet is returning to the sign it has been during the birth of the natal chart. So the last time the US experienced its Uranus return was during the Second World War, when the US used nuclear weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. As I said, Uranus is in the 7th house of the US, so the 7th house in astrology represents an area of open enemies and open allies. To people who do not heard about this before, An astrological chart is divided into 12 sections. Each house represents one certain area of life. In a chart of a nation, the 7th house represents open enemies. So during the last Uranus return, the US kind of like attacked its open enemies, and it's also created new allies. So with Uranus being there again in the 7th house of the US, we will definitely see how the US is going to form new alliances and also wants to do everything to destroy its open enemies. So many people, of course, they think about Iran, and yes, the tensions are very high. The US definitely has Iran as an open enemy and is currently bombing it, and we do have very strong tensions here, and Trump said himself he wants to destroy the whole population of Iran. However, actually, I find this a bit interesting because Iran, like the chart of Iran, is connected more with Uranus and Taurus. So first of all, Iran as a nation has the moon in Taurus, and the moon represents the population of people. It represents the population in general. So therefore, with Uranus being in Taurus, being in the very late degree of Taurus and touching the moon of Iran, the population is destabilized and has been bombed by the US, right? So when Uranus is moving into the new sign of Gemini, it could be that Iran is actually less affected by this transit. So I'm not saying that it's going to be less affected. It could also be that, I don't know, that things will quiet down for a while, because then in summer we will do have actually some energies where things can be highlighted again. Or it could of course also be that the US is dealing with Iran how it did deal with like other countries, like in a very aggressive way. But yeah, I'm just wanting to say that it doesn't mean that there's going to be nuclear war between the US and Iran. Actually, I don't think so. But I would have to look into astrocartography for that. I did not do it yet. I will probably keep analyzing the situation and do another episode about that. But yeah, just so far, I'm not even interested in making this like big predictions. But I said already in 2024, like 2.5 years ago, that there is going to be nuclear discussions within like the years of Uranus being in Gemini, and we are seeing that right now. And yeah, I just wanted to like say a bit that it doesn't have to be like Iran in that way. Yeah, so Trump himself has actually also Uranus and Gemini in his birth chart, and he's actually old enough to experience his own Uranus return, which is like crazy. So for Trump, it's going to affect his 10th house of reputation. So basically for him, a new career path, because the 10th house represents the career, and the public image can arise. So I think the question is here a bit about like how will he deal with the instability of his image. So he will do like everything to hold onto a very specific like image. So I was thinking how this like new AI image of him, like presenting himself as Jesus, kind of like fits into that, because he presents himself 10th house through an AI picture, Uranus in Gemini, using new technologies. Online, again, Uranus and Gemini, to portray himself in a new way, like to portray himself as a savior. So he has been portraying himself as a peacekeeper so far, but now he portrays himself as Jesus. So basically, he's kind of like, in an extreme way, holding onto the picture that he is the peacemaker, and he is not only the peacemaker, he is actually the savior, he's Jesus. So even Christians said that kind of like went a bit too far. So I think it like really fits to the like Uranus and Taurus shifting into Uranus and Gemini energies for him. Another country which has Uranus and Gemini is Pakistan, and there might be also like nuclear discussions arising. The last time Uranus was in Gemini, there were like discussions specifically between Pakistan and India going on. So I do think this tension might be activated again throughout the transit of Uranus and Gemini. So the transits or the tangents are going to be very strong during the ingress, which is happening on the 25th of April, so around about that time, but also during the beginning of July, specifically July 4th, because on July 4th, the planet Mars is joining Uranus in the sign of Gemini, so you have to think they're kind of like coming together like a blend. And when this happens, when this conjunction happens, this kind of like marks a turning point and marks a new cycle happening. So it's going to be like a new cycle of war, or a new cycle of like enemies and allies. Again, this is like a repetition from what we have seen during 1945. So yeah, there is like a similar energy going on. It is also happening on July 4th, which is the Independence Day of the US. So there's this connection about like the solar return of the US being connected to this like very strong new cycle of aggression. So yeah, the tangents are going on. So the questions of whether there will be a nuclear war or not is something, again, I will need to do some research further. But I also think, I'm not sure like how much importance there is of like answering these questions. I feel sometimes like predicting a nuclear war is kind of like dealing with the sensationist energy of like, you know, us in the West who maybe are not affected by this, not in the way like as the people are who are going to be affected by a potential nuclear war, are like, you know, thinking, is there going to be a war or not? I do think we need really to be careful when it comes to discussing those kind of things, because I personally want more to think about like, what is our responsibility in times of instability? And I believe that with Uranus and Gemini, the duty or the responsibility when it comes to liberating is something being connected to everyday conversations, and is something which includes also us as people who maybe do not live in those countries, or who are maybe more privileged in that way. You know, we have to continuously engage in discussing, we have to continuously engage in everyday protests and everyday forms of expressing our own political opinions. So we need to feel unstable, and we need to get out of our comfort zone in order to kind of like show or practice solidarity. And it is definitely about speaking our minds and not being afraid to question the like dominant narratives of or that are being propagated by the US and by the West. So I do believe like it's not only that I don't want to answer the question about like nuclear war, I feel also like I'm not sure what difference it does make, you know, because we are not sitting there with the like big button, you know, it's not us being sitting there. So we need to find ways of like using Uranus and Gemini in a way to protest, in a way to liberate, in a way to solidarize in that way, you know. So I don't want. So yeah, I think this is like more important. So I would actually encourage you during that time to read more, to get more into conversations, to kind of like really expand your mind and liberate your mind from the dominant narrative of that another world is not possible. Another world is always possible. Uranus and Gemini, the discovery of Uranus showed us that another world is always possible, and there might be some sacrifices we have to make to achieve this other world. But so with Uranus and Gemini, I do not believe that this other world is only possible. I do believe it is coming, you know, and we have to be part of the creation of this like new world. And with Uranus and Gemini, I urge you to think about what old concepts, what fixed idea, what fixed limitations you are living in, and not your individual life only, but in this like broader generational aspect, you know, thinking about like, we always think that capitalism is the only way we can live because we are so used to that. But on the other side, you know, on the other side of the swords, on the other side, there is always this new world possible. And there are people right now, literally, very powerful people right now being afraid that their power, that their old structures is being stripped away from them. So in times of uncertainty, you know, we do have the promise of Uranus. In times of instability, we do know that there is actually another world being born. And also with all of those planets right now being in the sign of Aries, I do believe that we do need to create this new world. We do need to believe in that new world, because it has to be that way. There's no other possibility, in my opinion. Yeah, okay guys, now I kind of like want to talk a bit about the impact of each transit for each ascendant. I actually like this podcast is like meant to be more of a collective energy reading, and I usually do not want to like use this podcast to kind of like always talk about the individual impacts. But I think with Uranus and Gemini, I'm making like a little like treat for you guys, because basically it's like a very big transit, and I think it might be interesting to know in which house it happens for you. So Uranus transits in the birth chart usually represent the part of the area of your life which is going to change, to disrupt, to uplift, or suddenly break. How this change is going to present and manifest itself really depends on the personal birth chart. Like for some people, Uranus can bring a very harsh change, like a breakup or whatsoever. But for others, it might feel like an uplifting. Like it really depends how the planet Uranus is interacting with your individual planets in your birth chart. So, if you want to know that, you can, of course, book a reading, even though I'm not offering readings right now, but maybe in the future. So yes, what I'm doing right now is a very general analysis, but it might be still interesting for some. And if you want to know about your own life, you should check either your rising sign or your sun sign. I would recommend to you to check your rising sign for like the area of your life. And for some people like Geminis maybe, for you it might be also interesting to look at your sun sign, because it can also affect that. Or for people who have a very like strong Gemini energy, as well as sometimes Virgo, Sagittarius, or Pisces energy. Alrighty. So for Aries people, or for Aries rising, the transit is going to be in your third house of the mental world. So in that, usually like that energy is going to activate the way you communicate, your skills, the way you transport yourself. So it might be that there are going to be like many new ideas in your head. You might, start with a podcast. You might start with like communicating your new ideas in a more liberate way, and also like to express yourself more strongly, and to actually like allow yourself to think differently. It can also activate new changes with like your siblings, and it could also be that you are going to move a lot. Like for example, you were someone who was just at home the whole day, and now with Uranus and Gemini, you're in the next years you will be like going from one place to another place, and things are always being a bit disruptive of that. Things are always going to be very disruptive in your environment, and it's good to go with that. Like it's important for you to not stand still. It's important for you to go with that flow. For Taurus, your Uranus is finally leaving your first house, so your identity could like gain new stability, or like finalize a disruption, and then Uranus is going to enter your second house of money and finances. So basically it's going to destabilize your finance sector, which is not bad. I had this energy too for over the past 7 years, and I became self-employed during that time. So basically like your income can be more unstable, but it gives you the chance to kind of like create unstable income, which doesn't mean less income, but it creates like new incomes, new ways of having income, and also like new ways of talents, like your talents, your values might be changing during that time also radically. For Gemini, it's like actually like full identity reset. Like the way you respond to new things can really change, and you make faster decisions. You maybe have more ideas of like who you want to be, and it's more, I think, like your indecisiveness could become less, and you're just like jumping into things, which can be a good thing as well. For Cancer, it's happening in your 12th house, which represents your subconscious. For you, it can really be a very internal shift. It might be that you become very spiritual during that time. Are you going to an overseas country? Are you isolating yourself? But in isolation, you have those like mental like breakthroughs and insights. It's very good for people who want to work in spiritual things, or onto their spiritual things, and a lot of like shadow work can just come up unexpectedly, and you will have like those mentally insights you did not expect to have. For Leo, Uranus is going to transit your 11th house, so your social networks might change drastically. Friendships, people you know, but also your long-term dreams can have this like radical change. It's very important for you during that time to actually meet new people, because they can like help you find new ways of like organizing your life. For Virgo, it's really about career and public image. So there might be like some disruption going on. So for many Virgos specifically, when Uranus is like touching the MC. It's going to really change the direction, what you want to do with your life, basically. And it can also change the way you want to be seen in the public sphere. For Libra, it's going to be about your belief system. Like maybe you're changing your studies, maybe you're changing the way you think about certain philosophical themes, about politics, about different cultures, and maybe you want to go more traveling. So it's like really this kind of like liberation, specifically connected to your mind. For Scorpio, it's going to be like a deep, like emotional change, considering maybe like shadow work, but at the same time, it can be just very connected to resources. So it might be that you will find new ways of, making money and also like investing. So it's good for Scorpio risings actually to kind of like think about like smaller investments. And it can also bring new ways of intimacy in your life and liberate yourself from like the way you pursue intimacy emotionally, but also physically. For Sagittarius rising, it's going to be about contracts. There might be like either a new relationship arising, there might be a break of relationship or a new contract coming, specifically when Uranus is hitting the degree of your own ascendant. So if you have a Sagittarius degree in the 7th, then it really depends on when Uranus is going to be around the 7th degree. But in general, it's about like redefining how you are acting within relationships. For Capricorn, it's a lot about like your work environment. So it's like a way maybe to kind of like deal with your own work structure, the things you have to do. Maybe you liberate yourself a bit from daily routines. Maybe you find more unique ways to kind of like feel free within your daily routines. Also in your health, like new ways to kind of like work with your health. For Aquarius, it's about romance and creativity. So that's a lot about like your self-expression and kind of like liberating yourselves from old ways of expressing yourself and actually being very unique and more romantic, more creative, and like putting yourself out there and more expressive, basically. And for Pisces, it's going to really change the structures where you're living. So you're, for the next years, either you're like moving out or like you're living, the place you are living is going to like change a bit. So it's also like kind of like changing what security means for you, and it can have also like shifts within family structures. Again, it really depends when Uranus is actually hitting the degree of your IC. But as I said, so it's really like a very general analysis, and I think it doesn't make so sense to go so deep into that because it really needs to be like examined throughout the whole chart. But yeah, that was kind of like an insight about what it means for each zodiac sign. Guys, that's it for the podcast episode. I hope you liked it. You kind of like can give me some ideas about what can I actually include in the podcast as like of formats. For example, sometimes in podcasts they're like at the beginning they mention like what they did the whole week or whatsoever, like any kind of format if you're interested in that. I was thinking also about some stuff, and as always, share your ideas, comment whatsoever, I like it, and see you in 2 weeks, I guess. Bye bye.